who the fuck is the client? Now that might sound like a strange question, but for strategists like me, it's actually a really interesting one. I'm Joe Burns, Head of Strategy at the independent creative agency Quality Meets Creative. And in this video, I want to ask what seems like a really simple question. Who actually is a strategist's client? Now, the obvious answer to this, and it's so obvious that really it's a tautology, is that the strategist's client is the client. And by client, I mean the marketing team at whatever company is paying the invoices. The kind of person who's flown in from Chicago or Dusseldorf to sit in a meeting room called something like Cerulean Chipmunk and ask whether the brand could appear in the first 3 seconds of the ad. Now, in one sense, this is clearly true. They are, after all, the people who are paying. But the trouble with this explanation starts when you look at what strategists actually do. Now, in most professions, the client arrives with a defined task, and the job is to execute that task as well as you can. But strategy is different. The strategist is brought in precisely because the task itself isn't clear. So the first job of strategy isn't executing that task, it's working out what the task actually is. And this means that in a strange way, the strategist client is the strategist. And that already complicates the idea that the client is simply the client. And once you start actually doing strategy, you quickly realise that you're working with several other forces all at the same time. You need to define the problem for the client's business. You need to translate it into something creatives can use. You've got to ground it in something that real, actual audiences in the world and the markets that they engage in actually care about. And that process is largely run by account management. So strategy sits awkwardly between several different groups, and they've all got different incentives and different goals. The client's business, the creative team, account management, and consumers themselves. This makes the question of who the strategist client actually is a lot less obvious. So let's work through some of the usual suspects. Now, the first one, and this is a popular answer inside agencies, particularly in creative departments, is that the strategist's real client is the creatives. After all, the brief is written for them, and the brief is the document where the strategist explains the problem, the opportunity, what kind of solution might make sense for those problems. And if a brief is good, it gives creatives somewhere to start. If the brief is bad, they just ignore it. So it's quite tempting to say that the strategists exist to serve creatives, and that strategy is essentially this kind of support function for the creative department, sort of like they make intellectual scaffolding that helps the creatives build the work. And there is definitely some truth to that, but it's not quite right. Because if the strategist's job was simply to serve creatives, the job would mostly consist of telling them what they want to hear, which, if you've ever met any creatives, would usually involve reassuring them that their first idea was brilliant and that the client will absolutely buy it, and that anyone who tries to change it is an enemy of creativity. Now that might be quite entertaining, but it wouldn't be strategy. The next possibility is that the strategist client is account management. This happens a lot. In fact, it happens so often that many strategists secretly suspect it might be the default operating system of the whole ad industry. In this version of the world, strategy exists to make the process run smoothly. The strategist explains the work to the client. They wrap the creative ideas in this kind of thin layer of logic. And what they're there to do is ensure that nothing too surprising happens between the client brief and the creative presentation. This is very, very comfortable, but it's also extremely tragic because strategy that exists to serve the process quickly becomes an exercise in post-rationalization. You have a department dedicated to explaining why the things we already wanted to do was actually the best and correct strategic decision all along. Now that would make the job very, very easy, and it does, but it also makes it something that's both depressing and not strategy. The next possibility, and this is something that was really fashionable about 20 years ago, is the idea that the strategist client is really the consumer. The strategist, it said, is the voice of the consumer in the room, and that sounds an admirable thing. And also strangely mystical. The consumer is, of course, not actually in the room. The consumer is at home, eating cereal, watching Netflix, and thinking about something completely unrelated to mayonnaise or insurance or telecoms. No consumer has ever appointed a group of strategists as their official ambassadors. And if consumers discovered someone standing in an open plan office in Soho claiming to speak on their behalf, they would probably find the whole thing very unsettling. This doesn't mean consumers aren't important, it just means that speaking for them is not the same as understanding them. Okay, now let's talk about who I think the real client is. And here's the problem. A strategist works with many different stakeholders. but they can't fully serve any one of them. You have to be helpful to the client, you have to be useful to the creatives, you've got to cooperate with account management and informed about consumers. But the moment you become subordinate to any one of these groups, you stop doing strategy. You start doing something else. So, if the strategist client is not quite the client, and it's not quite the creatives, and it's not quite account management, and it's not quite the consumer, then who is it? I think the answer is this. The strategist client is the problem. It's not the people, it's not the process, it's not even the politics. It's the problem. Sometimes that problem belongs to the client. Sometimes it belongs to the category that the brand operates in. Sometimes it belongs to the brand itself, and occasionally it belongs to the agency. But wherever it lives, the strategist's loyalty ultimately sits there, with the problem and solving it. And this is why strategy often feels very inconvenient, because if your client is the problem rather than the people, several things logically follow. Sometimes you have to disagree with the client. Sometimes you disappoint the creatives, and very often you complicate the smooth running of account management's process. Occasionally, you have to admit that what the consumer wants is not particularly helpful to the brand. In other words, strategy becomes the department responsible for saying the annoying but necessary thing. You're not really there to make one particular person happy. You're there to make the answer right. And in advertising, those two things are very often not the same. So, back to the original question. Who the fuck is a strategist client? It's the problem.